The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse office, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where Marcus Sullivan sat motionless. His hands trembled as he held the latest medical report, the words blurring together through his exhausted eyes. Terminal illness. 6 months, maybe less. His 8-year-old daughter Emma was dying, and despite all his wealth, all his connections, all his power as the CEO of Sullivan Industries, he was completely powerless to save her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years ago, Emma had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that attacked her digestive system with relentless fury. What started as occasional stomach aches had evolved into a nightmare that consumed their lives. Emma couldn't keep food down for more than minutes at a time. Every meal became a battle, every bite a potential trigger for hours of agony. The once vibrant little girl who used to run through their sprawling estate in Connecticut had withered away to barely 60 pounds, her bright blue eyes now sunken in a face that looked far too old for her years. Marcus remembered the exact moment his world changed forever. It was a Tuesday evening in October, and Emma had been complaining of stomach pain during dinner. Sarah, his wife, had dismissed it as growing pains, encouraging Emma to finish her chicken nuggets. But within an hour, Emma was doubled over in pain so severe that she couldn't speak, only whimper like a wounded animal. The emergency room visit that night led to weeks of tests, consultations with specialists, and finally the devastating diagnosis that would alter the trajectory of their family forever. The condition had no cure, only management strategies that seemed to fail as quickly as they were implemented. Emma's body rejected almost everything. Proteins caused inflammation, dairy triggered violent episodes, even the blandest foods sent her digestive system into chaos. She had been hospitalized 17 times in 3 years, each stay longer and more frightening than the last. The medical bills had exceeded $2 million, though money was never the issue for Marcus. What broke him was watching his little girl fade away, meal by meal, day by day. Sarah had been the first casualty of their family crisis. The stress, the sleepless nights, the constant fear had eroded their marriage until it crumbled entirely. She had moved out 8 months ago, unable to bear watching Emma deteriorate while feeling helpless to help. The divorce papers were signed in silence, both parents too emotionally drained to fight over anything except Emma's care. Sarah visited twice a week now, her own guilt and grief making longer stays unbearable. Marcus understood her pain, but he also resented her abandonment when Emma needed both parents most. The parade of caregivers had begun almost immediately after Sarah left. Marcus had hired the most qualified professionals money could buy. Registered nurses with decades of experience, nutritional specialists with impressive credentials, even a few who came highly recommended by other wealthy families dealing with similar challenges. Each one arrived with confidence and departed in defeat, unable to coax Emma to eat more than a few spoonfuls before her body revolted. The first caregiver, Janet Morrison, lasted exactly 3 weeks. She was a stern woman in her 50s who approached Emma's condition like a military operation, with rigid meal schedules and no tolerance for Emma's resistance. When Emma refused to eat her specially prepared protein smoothie on a particularly difficult morning, Janet had raised her voice, insisting that discipline was what the child needed. Emma had burst into tears, and Marcus had terminated Janet's employment within the hour. He would not allow anyone to add emotional trauma to his daughter's already unbearable physical suffering. The second caregiver, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia, lasted longer but ultimately failed for different reasons. She was incredibly kind and patient with Emma, sitting beside her bed for hours and reading stories while Emma nibbled at crackers. But Patricia lacked the medical knowledge to adapt when Emma's condition worsened. During a particularly severe flare-up, Patricia had panicked and called 911 instead of administering the emergency medication that Emma's doctors had prescribed. Marcus realized that kindness alone wasn't enough. Emma needed someone who could navigate the complex medical protocols while still maintaining the emotional support she desperately craved. The third caregiver was a young man named David, who specialized in pediatric nutrition. He arrived with an arsenal of supplements, specialized formulas, and innovative feeding techniques he had learned working with children who had similar conditions. For the first week, Marcus felt hopeful as David managed to get Emma to consume small amounts of a specially formulated broth that seemed to settle better in her stomach than anything she had tried before. But Emma's body adapted quickly, developing new sensitivities that rendered David's carefully crafted nutrition plan useless. Within 2 weeks, she was back to rejecting everything he offered, and David admitted defeat, recommending that Marcus seek care from a specialized clinic in Switzerland. Marcus had indeed flown Emma to Switzerland, then to Germany, and finally to a cutting-edge treatment center in Japan. Each journey had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and exposed Emma to experimental treatments that offered hope but delivered disappointment. The Swiss doctors had tried enzyme replacement therapy. The German specialists had attempted to reset Emma's immune system with controlled fasting, followed by carefully reintroduced foods. The Japanese researchers had used advanced probiotics and gut microbiome transplants. Nothing worked for more than a few weeks before Emma's body found new ways to reject nourishment. Upon returning to Connecticut, Marcus had continued his search for the perfect caregiver. The fourth was Maria Santos, a woman who had successfully helped other children with eating disorders. She lasted 2 months longer than most, but ultimately left when Emma's weight dropped below 55 pounds despite her best efforts. Maria had wept when she submitted her resignation, telling Marcus that she felt like a failure for being unable to help such a sweet child. The fifth caregiver was Dr. Helen Wright, a pediatric gastroenterologist who had taken a sabbatical from her hospital position to provide private care. Marcus had paid her 3 times her hospital salary, hoping that having a doctor as a full-time caregiver would finally provide Emma with the expert care she needed. Dr. Wright had indeed provided excellent medical management, adjusting medications with precision and monitoring Emma's condition with scientific rigor. But she lacked the warmth and emotional connection that Emma craved, treating her more like a fascinating case study than a frightened little girl. Emma had become increasingly withdrawn under Dr. Wright's care, barely speaking even to her father. After 6 weeks, Marcus had made the difficult decision to let Dr. Wright go, realizing that Emma needed healing that went beyond medical expertise. The 6th through 10th caregivers had blended together in Marcus's memory, each bringing their own approach and ultimately their own reasons for leaving. Some quit because they couldn't handle watching Emma suffer. Others left because they felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for such a critically ill child. A few had been dismissed by Marcus when their methods proved ineffective or when their personalities clashed with Emma's fragile emotional state. The 11th caregiver, Robert Chen, had been a male nurse who specialized in home health care for terminally ill children. Marcus had hoped that having a male caregiver might provide a different dynamic that could reach Emma in ways the female caregivers had not. Robert was competent and caring, but Emma seemed uncomfortable with his presence, becoming even more withdrawn than usual. After 3 weeks of minimal progress, Robert had suggested that Emma might benefit from the familiarity of female caregivers, and Marcus had reluctantly agreed to end their arrangement. The 12th and 13th caregivers had each lasted less than 2 weeks. Both were highly qualified professionals who had worked with children with severe medical conditions, but neither could establish the connection with Emma that was necessary for her to trust them enough to try eating. Emma had become increasingly resistant to new faces, new voices, new attempts to help her. She would curl up in her bed and turn away when caregivers tried to interact with her, as if she had already decided that they too would eventually leave. The 14th caregiver, Linda Thompson, had arrived with impressive credentials and a warm personality that initially seemed promising. She had worked with several families dealing with rare pediatric conditions and came with glowing references. For the first few days, Emma had shown more interest in Linda than she had in any caregiver for months. Linda had a gentle way of speaking to Emma, treating her like the intelligent 8-year-old she was rather than talking down to her like many of the previous caregivers had done. She explained medical procedures in terms Emma could understand and always asked permission before giving medications or taking vital signs.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But even Linda's promising start had eventually faltered. Emma's condition had worsened during Linda's 3rd week, and the stress of managing the increasingly complex medical situation had taken its toll. Linda had made a medication error that, while not dangerous, had caused Emma to experience several hours of additional discomfort. The incident had shaken Linda's confidence, and she had begun second-guessing every decision. Emma, who was remarkably perceptive despite her young age, had sensed Linda's uncertainty and had become less cooperative as a result. When Linda had submitted her resignation after 4 weeks, citing the emotional toll of the position, Marcus had barely reacted. He was becoming numb to the disappointment. The 15th caregiver, Dr. Amanda Foster, was Marcus's last desperate attempt to find professional help before considering the unthinkable option of placing Emma in a long-term care facility. Foster was a pediatric psychiatrist who specialized in medical trauma and eating disorders in children. Marcus had hoped that addressing the psychological aspects of Emma's condition might unlock some pathway to healing that had been overlooked by the purely medical approaches they had tried. Dr. Foster had arrived with an impressive arsenal of therapeutic techniques and a confident demeanor that initially inspired hope. She had extensive experience working with children who had developed food aversion due to medical trauma, and she approached Emma's case with a comprehensive plan that addressed both the physical and psychological aspects of her condition. For the first time in months, Marcus had felt genuine optimism that they might finally have found someone who could help Emma. The initial sessions had indeed shown promise. Dr. Foster had spent hours talking with Emma, using art therapy and play therapy techniques to help her express her fears and frustrations about food and eating. Emma had created drawings that revealed the depth of her anxiety around mealtimes, depicting her stomach as a monster that attacked her whenever she tried to eat. Dr. Foster had validated these fears while working to develop coping strategies that might help Emma feel more in control of her eating experience. But as weeks passed, it became clear that even Dr. Foster's sophisticated psychological interventions were not enough to overcome the severe physical aspects of Emma's condition. While Emma had become more willing to talk about her fears and had developed some coping mechanisms for managing anxiety around mealtimes, her body continued to reject almost everything she consumed. The psychological healing that Dr. Foster facilitated was valuable, but it could not address the underlying autoimmune dysfunction that was destroying Emma's digestive system. After 2 months of intensive therapy with minimal improvement in Emma's nutritional status, Dr. Foster had recommended that Emma be admitted to a specialized pediatric facility that could provide round-the-clock medical and psychological support. She had explained gently but firmly that Emma's condition had progressed beyond what could be safely managed in a home environment, even with the best professional care. The recommendation had felt like a death sentence to Marcus, who could not bear the thought of Emma spending her final months in an institutional setting, surrounded by strangers instead of the comfort of home. The conversation with Dr. Foster that led to her departure had been one of the most painful of Marcus's life. She had sat in his study, her professional composure barely masking her own frustration and sadness at being unable to help Emma more effectively. She had explained that she had consulted with colleagues across the country, reviewed the latest research on Emma's rare condition, and exhausted every therapeutic approach in her considerable arsenal. Emma's case was simply beyond the current capabilities of medical science, and continuing to cycle through caregivers at home was potentially doing more harm than good by preventing Emma from receiving the intensive institutional care that might extend her life. Marcus had listened to Dr. Foster's recommendations with growing despair, knowing that she was probably right but unable to accept that he had failed to find a way to help his daughter. The weight of 15 failed attempts at finding the right caregiver pressed down on him like a physical burden, each departure representing another door closing on Emma's chances for recovery. He had thanked Dr. Foster for her efforts and her honesty, but had made it clear that he was not ready to give up on finding a solution that would allow Emma to remain at home. Foster's departure, Marcus had retreated to his study and remained there for 3 days, barely eating himself as he wrestled with the reality of his situation. His assistant, Jennifer, had fielded calls from business associates and postponed meetings, understanding that her boss was facing a crisis that transcended any professional obligation. The house had felt eerily quiet without the presence of a caregiver, with only Marcus and Emma rattling around in the vast space that had once been filled with laughter and hope. Emma had seemed almost relieved when Dr. Foster left, though she had grown fond of the kind doctor during their time together. At 8 years old, Emma had developed a wisdom about her condition that was both heartbreaking and remarkable. She understood that she was very sick, and she had observed the pattern of caregivers arriving with optimism and leaving with disappointment. In her child's mind, she had begun to believe that she was unfixable, that her body was too broken for anyone to help. During those 3 days without professional care, Marcus had attempted to manage Emma's needs himself, drawing on everything he had learned from watching the 15 caregivers who had come before. He had administered medications on schedule, attempted to coax her to sip small amounts of broth, and monitored her vital signs with the equipment that had become permanent fixtures in their home. But it had quickly become apparent that he lacked both the medical expertise and the emotional distance necessary to be Emma's primary caregiver. Every time she refused food or expressed pain, Marcus felt his heart breaking anew, making it impossible for him to maintain the calm, encouraging presence that Emma needed. The breaking point had come on the 3rd night, when Emma had experienced one of her worst episodes in months. She had managed to keep down a few spoonfuls of rice pudding during dinner, giving Marcus a brief moment of hope, but within an hour she had been racked with abdominal pain so severe that she could barely breathe. Marcus had called Emma's primary physician, Dr. Rodriguez, who had talked him through the emergency medication protocol over the phone, but the hours that followed had been terrifying for both father and daughter. Emma had writhed in pain while Marcus held her, both of them crying as they waited for the medication to take effect. In that moment, Marcus had felt the full weight of his inadequacy as a caregiver, realizing that his love for Emma, while boundless, was not enough to provide her with the skilled care she needed. The incident had reinforced his determination to find another caregiver, despite the string of failures that had preceded this moment. The next morning, Marcus had called the agency that had provided most of the previous caregivers, explaining his situation to the director with a desperation that he no longer tried to hide. The agency director, Mrs. Patterson, had been sympathetic but honest about the challenges of finding someone willing to take on such a difficult case. Word had spread through the professional caregiving community about the Sullivan position. The high pay was attractive, but the emotional toll of caring for a dying child who could not be helped had scared away many potential candidates. Mrs. Patterson had explained that she had exhausted her roster of qualified pediatric caregivers and that Marcus might need to consider expanding his search beyond traditional healthcare professionals. She had suggested that he might benefit from hiring someone with less formal medical training, but more flexibility and creativity in their approach. The suggestion had initially frustrated Marcus, who felt that Emma needed the most qualified professionals available, but his options were rapidly dwindling. It was Mrs. Patterson who had first suggested that Marcus consider hiring household staff who might be willing to take on some caregiving responsibilities while he continued his search for a qualified medical professional. She had explained that sometimes children responded better to caregivers who approached them without the clinical distance that medical professionals necessarily maintained. The idea had seemed absurd to Marcus at first. How could a housekeeper or cook possibly provide the specialized care that 15 trained professionals had failed to deliver? But as the days passed and Emma continued to deteriorate, Marcus had begun to consider more unconventional approaches. He had read stories online of families who had found unexpected solutions to medical challenges through the kindness and intuition of people without formal medical training. While these anecdotal accounts seemed too good to be true, Marcus's desperation had reached a point where he was willing to consider possibilities that his rational mind would have dismissed just months earlier. The house had been without household staff for nearly a year, as Marcus had devoted all of his attention and resources to finding medical care for Emma. The cleaning and maintenance had been handled by a rotating crew of service professionals who came and went without establishing relationships with the family. Meals had been prepared by the caregivers or delivered from restaurants, though Emma rarely ate enough to make meal preparation a significant concern. The domestic routines that had once provided structure and comfort to their family life had been abandoned in favor of the urgent medical needs that dominated their existence. As Marcus sat in his study on that fourth night without a caregiver, listening to Emma's labored breathing through the baby monitor he had installed in her room, he had made a decision that would change everything. He would hire a housekeeper and a cook, people who could provide some basic care and companionship for Emma, while he resumed his search for a qualified medical caregiver. It was not an ideal solution, but it would ensure that Emma was not alone while allowing Marcus to return to work part-time to manage the business crises that had been accumulating during his extended absence.
The decision had felt like both a surrender and a new beginning. Marcus was acknowledging that his systematic approach to finding the perfect caregiver had failed, and that he needed to try something different, even if it seemed less logical or professional. At the same time, he was not giving up on Emma. He was simply expanding his definition of what help might look like, opening his mind to possibilities that he had not previously considered. Little did Marcus know that this decision would lead him to discover that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from the most qualified professionals, but from the most unlikely sources, and that the solution to Emma's crisis would arrive not with impressive credentials, but with something far more powerful and mysterious: the simple act of preparing food with love. The employment agency had been less than enthusiastic about Marcus's unconventional request. When he had called Thompson Domestic Services on that grey November morning, explaining that he needed household staff who might be willing to provide basic care for his medically fragile daughter, the silence on the other end of the line had stretched uncomfortably long. The agency director, Miss Rebecca Thompson, had finally responded with professional caution, explaining that most domestic workers were not trained or insured to provide medical care, and that the liability issues alone made such an arrangement problematic. But Marcus had pressed forward, his desperation overriding his usual business pragmatism. He had offered to pay triple the standard rates, provide comprehensive insurance coverage, and sign liability waivers that would protect any staff member from legal consequences related to Emma's medical condition. He had made it clear that he was not asking for medical expertise, but simply for someone who could provide companionship and basic household support, while he continued searching for qualified medical professionals. The generous compensation package and Marcus's reputation as a fair employer had eventually convinced Miss Thompson to circulate his unusual request among her most trusted staff members. 3 days later, Marcus had received a call that would change everything, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. Thompson had explained that she had found someone who might be interested in the position, though she had cautioned that the candidate was not what Marcus would typically expect for a household position in a home like his. The woman's name was Rosa Martinez, and she was 53 years old with over 20 years of experience as a professional cook and housekeeper. She had worked primarily for middle-class families rather than wealthy employers, but her references were exceptional, with several families describing her as someone who had become like family to them. What made Rosa unusual, Miss Thompson had explained, was her background caring for her own grandson, who had been born with severe developmental disabilities and multiple medical conditions. Rosa had spent 5 years as his primary caregiver while his parents worked, learning to manage complex medication schedules, specialized diets, and the emotional challenges that came with caring for a child with serious health issues. Her grandson had passed away 2 years earlier, and Rosa had taken a leave of absence from domestic work to grieve and recover. She was now ready to return to work, but she had specifically requested positions where she could help families dealing with medical challenges, feeling that her experience might be valuable to parents facing similar struggles. The description had intrigued Marcus, though he had tried to manage his expectations after so many disappointments. He had agreed to meet with Rosa the following day, scheduling the interview for the afternoon when Emma was typically resting and might be more receptive to meeting a new person. As he had prepared for the meeting, Marcus had found himself hoping that Rosa would be different from the parade of professional caregivers who had come before, but also steeling himself for another inevitable disappointment. Rosa Martinez had arrived at the Sullivan estate on a crisp December afternoon, driving a modest sedan that looked almost comically small parked beside Marcus's collection of luxury vehicles. She was a petite woman with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a navy blue dress and practical shoes that spoke of someone accustomed to being on her feet all day. Her appearance was unremarkable, but when Marcus had opened the door and looked into her warm brown eyes, he had sensed something different about her that he could not quite identify. They had sat in Marcus's study, the same room where he had conducted interviews with 15 medical professionals, but the conversation with Rosa had felt entirely different from those formal consultations. Where the previous caregivers had focused on their credentials and experience with similar cases, Rosa had asked questions about Emma herself. She had wanted to know what Emma had been like before she became sick, what activities she had enjoyed, what food she had loved, what made her laugh. Marcus had found himself talking about his daughter as a person rather than as a patient, sharing memories of Emma's personality and interests that he had not thought about in months. Rosa had listened with an attention that went beyond professional interest, nodding and asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine curiosity about Emma's life beyond her illness. She had asked about Emma's relationship with her mother, about how the divorce had affected her, about whether Emma missed having other children around. The questions had been gentle but perceptive, revealing Rosa's understanding that a sick child was still a child, with emotional needs that extended far beyond medical care. When Marcus had explained Emma's condition and the failures of previous caregivers, Rosa had listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious but never showing the doubt or concern that had appeared on other faces during similar conversations. She had asked practical questions about medication schedules and dietary restrictions, but she had also asked about Emma's daily routine, her sleeping patterns and her mood throughout the day. Rosa seemed to understand instinctively that caring for Emma would require addressing her whole experience, not just her medical needs. The conversation had taken an unexpected turn when Rosa had begun talking about her grandson, Miguel. She had described a child who had faced multiple hospitalizations, dietary restrictions and chronic pain, but who had also loved music, playing with toy cars, and helping her cook simple dishes in the kitchen. Rosa had spoken about the importance of finding moments of joy and normalcy, even in the midst of serious illness, about how small pleasures could provide comfort and hope when medical treatments failed to deliver relief. Marcus had been struck by Rosa's perspective on caring for sick children. Where the medical professionals had focused on protocols and interventions, Rosa talked about presence and patience. She had explained that in her experience, children who were suffering often needed to feel understood and accepted rather than fixed or cured. She had described sitting with Miguel during his most difficult moments, not trying to make him feel better, but simply being with him in his pain, letting him know that he was not alone. The philosophy had resonated with something deep in Marcus's heart, though he had struggled to reconcile it with his desperate need to find someone who could actually help Emma eat. Rosa had seemed to sense his internal conflict, explaining gently that she believed her role would not be to cure Emma, but to support her and Marcus through whatever lay ahead. She had made it clear that she understood the seriousness of Emma's condition and had no illusions about being able to accomplish what medical professionals had not, but she had also expressed confidence that she could provide comfort and stability during a terrifying time. What had ultimately convinced Marcus to hire Rosa was not any specific credential or promise, but rather the way she had talked about Emma after hearing her story. Rosa had spoken as if she already cared about this child she had never met, expressing sadness about Emma's suffering and determination to help her feel less afraid and alone. There had been something maternal in Rosa's response that reminded Marcus of how people had talked about Emma before she became sick, when she was seen as a precious little girl rather than a medical case. Rosa had started work the following Monday, arriving early in the morning with 2 large canvas bags that she had explained contained everything she needed to begin caring for the household and Emma. Marcus had given her a tour of the house, showing her Emma's room, the kitchen, and the medical supply closet where Emma's medications and equipment were stored. Rosa had taken notes about medication schedules and emergency procedures, but she had spent equal time asking about Emma's preferences for lighting, temperature, and noise levels in her room. The first meeting between Rosa and Emma had been carefully orchestrated by Marcus, who had learned from previous experiences that his daughter responded poorly to sudden introductions of new caregivers. He had explained to Emma that Rosa was coming to help with cooking and cleaning, deliberately downplaying the caregiving aspect that had become so fraught with disappointment. Emma had agreed to meet Rosa, though she had remained in bed, wrapped in her favorite blanket and clutching a stuffed elephant that had been a gift from her mother. Rosa had entered Emma's room quietly, carrying a small wooden box that immediately caught Emma's attention. She had introduced herself simply, explaining that she was there to help take care of the house and that she had brought something special to show Emma. The wooden box, Rosa had explained, contained her most precious cooking spices, herbs and seasonings that she had collected over many years of cooking for families she loved. She had opened the box carefully, revealing small glass jars filled with aromatic spices, each one labeled in Rosa's careful handwriting. Emma had been curious despite herself, leaning forward slightly to peer into the box. Rosa had selected a small jar containing cinnamon and had held it out for Emma to smell, explaining that it was special cinnamon from Mexico that her grandmother had taught her to use in sweetbreads. Emma had inhaled tentatively, and for the first time in weeks, Marcus had seen something resembling interest in his daughter's eyes. Rosa had shown Emma several more spices, telling brief stories about each one and where it came from, treating Emma like a fellow cook rather than a sick child. The interaction had lasted only 10 minutes, but it had been more positive than Emma's initial meetings with most of the professional caregivers. Rosa had not tried to discuss Emma's condition or encourage her to eat, instead focusing on sharing something she was passionate about in a way that invited Emma's curiosity without pressure. When Rosa had closed the spice box and prepared to leave, Emma had asked quietly if she would bring it back the next day. Rosa had smiled and promised that she would, explaining that she hoped Emma might help her choose which spices to use when she cooked. Over the following days, Rosa had established routines that slowly began to change the atmosphere of the house. She had arrived each morning at 7, beginning her day by preparing fresh coffee for Marcus and checking on Emma, who was usually awake but still in bed. Rosa's presence in the house was quiet but constant, moving through rooms with efficient grace, restoring order and cleanliness that had been neglected during the chaos of the previous months. But it was Rosa's approach to cooking that had first captured Emma's attention in a meaningful way. Rather than preparing meals in isolation and bringing them to Emma's room as previous caregivers had done, Rosa had begun cooking in a way that filled the house with enticing aromas. She had started with simple preparations, making fresh bread in the early morning so that the scent of baking would drift throughout the house as Emma woke up. The bread itself was not intended for Emma, who could not tolerate most baked goods, but the smell seemed to awaken something in her that had been dormant for months. On her third day, Rosa had asked Emma if she would like to watch her cook, explaining that she often found cooking more enjoyable when she had company. Emma had been hesitant at first, but curiosity had won out, and she had allowed Rosa to help her to the kitchen, where a comfortable chair had been positioned to give Emma a clear view of Rosa's work without requiring her to stand for long periods. Rosa had been preparing a simple vegetable broth, moving with practiced efficiency, while maintaining a steady stream of gentle conversation about her ingredients and techniques. Emma had watched in fascination as Rosa had selected vegetables from the refrigerator, examining each one carefully and explaining how to choose the best onions, carrots, and celery for making broth. She had described the importance of cutting vegetables uniformly so they would cook evenly, demonstrating her knife skills while keeping up a running commentary about cooking techniques she had learned from her mother and grandmother. Emma had not said much during that first cooking session, but she had remained in the kitchen for over an hour, longer than she had engaged with any activity in months.
The breakthrough had come during Rosa's second week, when she had been preparing a batch of homemade chicken stock. Emma had been watching from her usual chair when Rosa had begun adding herbs and seasonings to the simmering pot, selecting each ingredient from her wooden spice box and explaining its contribution to the overall flavor. Emma had asked tentatively if she could smell the oregano before Rosa added it to the pot, and Rosa had immediately brought the jar over to Emma, encouraging her to inhale deeply and describe what the scent reminded her of. Emma had closed her eyes and breathed in the oregano, a small smile crossing her face as she had announced that it smelled like pizza. Rosa had laughed delightedly, explaining that oregano was indeed one of the key flavors in pizza sauce and that she had learned to make pizza from scratch when she was not much older than Emma. The conversation had led to Emma asking questions about other spices, and before long, Rosa had been giving Emma an impromptu lesson in herbs and seasonings, letting her smell each one and guess what foods it might be used in. The spice-smelling sessions had become a daily ritual, with Emma eagerly anticipating Rosa's arrival each morning and immediately asking what they would be cooking that day. Rosa had begun planning her cooking around Emma's interests, choosing recipes that would introduce her to new flavors and aromas without any pressure to actually consume the food being prepared. Emma had become increasingly animated during these sessions, asking questions about cooking techniques and sharing memories of foods she had loved before becoming sick. It had been during one of these cooking sessions that Emma had made a request that had stunned both Rosa and Marcus, who had been listening from the adjacent dining room. Rosa had been preparing a simple rice pudding, explaining how the rice would slowly absorb the milk and spices to create a creamy dessert, when Emma had asked quietly if she could taste just a tiny spoonful. The request had been so unexpected that Rosa had needed a moment to process it, as Emma had not expressed interest in actually eating anything for several weeks. Rosa had responded with careful calm, ladling a small amount of the warm pudding into a tiny bowl and offering Emma a baby spoon. Emma had held the spoon hesitantly, looking at the pudding as if it might harm her, before taking the smallest possible taste. She had sat quietly for a moment, waiting for the familiar pain to begin, but when nothing happened immediately, she had taken another small taste, then another. Marcus had watched from the doorway in amazement as his daughter consumed nearly a full tablespoon of rice pudding, more food than she had successfully eaten in days. Emma had eaten slowly and cautiously, pausing between each tiny bite to assess how her body was responding, but she had finished the entire portion without experiencing any immediate distress. When she had set down the empty bowl, she had looked up at Rosa with something approaching wonder, as if she could not quite believe what had just happened. The rice pudding incident had marked the beginning of a gradual transformation in Emma's relationship with food. Rosa had been careful not to make too much of the success, treating it as a pleasant development rather than a miraculous breakthrough, but she had begun incorporating more opportunities for Emma to taste small amounts of food during their cooking sessions. Not every attempt had been successful. Emma's condition remained unpredictable, and many foods still triggered painful reactions, but the fear that had previously surrounded all food had begun to diminish.
Rosa's approach to feeding Emma had been completely different from the strategies employed by previous caregivers. Where medical professionals had focused on nutritional content and caloric density, Rosa had emphasized flavor, aroma, and the emotional experience of eating. She had prepared tiny portions of foods that smelled appealing, served them in beautiful dishes, and presented them as opportunities for exploration rather than medical necessities. The small successes had gradually built upon each other. Emma had discovered that she could tolerate small amounts of Rosa's homemade chicken broth, especially when it was served warm in a delicate teacup rather than a medical-looking bowl. She had found that plain rice cooked with a single bay leaf and a pinch of salt stayed down better than the bland rice prescribed by nutritionists. Most surprisingly, she had developed a tolerance for Rosa's soft scrambled eggs, prepared with butter and a tiny amount of fresh herbs, something that contradicted everything her doctors had said about her inability to process proteins. Rosa had kept detailed notes about which foods Emma could tolerate and under what circumstances, but her record-keeping had been more intuitive than scientific. She had observed that Emma ate better when she was relaxed and engaged in conversation, worse when she felt pressured or watched too closely. She had noticed that Emma's appetite was better in the morning, that she preferred food served at specific temperatures, and that the presentation of food mattered as much as its content. More importantly, Rosa had begun to understand Emma's emotional relationship with eating. Through patient conversation during their cooking sessions, Rosa had learned that Emma had developed a complex set of fears and associations around food that went beyond her physical symptoms. Emma had begun to see eating as something dangerous, something that inevitably led to pain and disappointment. Rosa had worked gently to help Emma separate the act of eating from the expectation of suffering, treating each meal as a new possibility rather than a repeat of previous failures. The changes in Emma had extended beyond her eating habits. As she had begun to spend more time in the kitchen with Rosa, she had become more talkative and engaged than she had been in months. She had started asking questions about Rosa's family, her childhood, and her experiences caring for her grandson Miguel. Rosa had shared stories freely, treating Emma as a trusted friend rather than a patient, and Emma had begun to reciprocate with her own memories and thoughts. Marcus had observed these changes with growing amazement and cautious hope. The house had felt more alive with Rosa's presence, filled with cooking aromas, and the sound of Emma's voice engaged in animated conversation. Emma had begun getting dressed in the morning instead of staying in pajamas all day, and she had started asking to help with simple cooking tasks like stirring ingredients or setting timers. But the most profound change had been in Emma's overall demeanor. The defeated, resigned expression that had characterized her face for months had been replaced by something resembling curiosity about the world around her. She had begun to show interest in activities beyond her immediate survival, asking Rosa to teach her about different types of cuisine and wondering aloud about cooking techniques she might want to learn when she felt better. Rosa had been careful never to make promises about Emma's recovery or to suggest that her improved eating represented a cure for her underlying condition. She had maintained realistic expectations while celebrating small victories, treating each successful meal as a gift rather than evidence of permanent improvement. Her approach had been to focus on the present moment, helping Emma find pleasure and comfort in whatever eating she could manage, rather than worrying about long-term nutritional goals. The relationship between Rosa and Emma had deepened beyond the practical aspects of caregiving. Rosa had begun reading to Emma during quiet afternoon hours, sharing stories from her own childhood and encouraging Emma to talk about her dreams and fears. Emma had confided in Rosa about missing her mother, about feeling guilty for being sick, and about her worry that she was making her father sad. Rosa had listened to these concerns with the same attention she gave to Emma's physical needs, offering comfort and reassurance without trying to minimize Emma's very real fears. As December had progressed toward the holidays, Rosa had suggested that she and Emma work together to prepare some special holiday treats, not necessarily for Emma to eat, but as a way of participating in the season's traditions.
Emma had embraced the idea enthusiastically, and they had spent several afternoons making Christmas cookies, holiday breads, and traditional Mexican sweets that Rosa had learned from her family. Emma had been able to taste small amounts of some of these treats, but more importantly, she had experienced the joy of creating something beautiful and meaningful. The holiday cooking project had given Emma a sense of purpose and accomplishment that had been missing from her life for months. She had carefully decorated cookies with icing and sprinkles, taking pride in making each one unique and special. She had helped Rosa prepare gift baskets of homemade treats for the postal workers, delivery drivers, and other service people who regularly visited the house, experiencing the pleasure of giving to others rather than constantly being the recipient of care and concern. Marcus had watched these developments with emotions that ranged from gratitude to disbelief. The woman who had arrived at his house with modest credentials and simple expectations had accomplished something that 15 highly qualified medical professionals had not been able to achieve. Emma was not cured, her underlying condition remained serious, and her eating was still limited and unpredictable, but she had rediscovered aspects of herself that had seemed lost forever. The success had not been without setbacks. Emma still experienced difficult days when her condition flared, and she could not keep down even the foods that usually worked for her. There had been nights when she had been in significant pain despite Rosa's best efforts, and mornings when she had been too sick to participate in their usual cooking activities. But Rosa's presence had provided stability and comfort during these difficult periods, and the overall trajectory had been toward improvement rather than decline. By Christmas, Emma had gained 3 pounds, the first weight gain she had experienced in over 6 months. More significantly, she had regained aspects of her personality that her illness had suppressed. She had begun laughing again, telling jokes and expressing opinions about things beyond her immediate medical needs. She had started making plans for future cooking projects with Rosa, talking about recipes she wanted to learn and dishes she hoped to be able to eat someday. The transformation had not gone unnoticed by Emma's medical team. Rodriguez, her primary physician, had been amazed by the improvements in Emma's condition during his monthly visit, noting not only her weight gain but also improvements in her energy level and overall demeanor. He had asked detailed questions about Rosa's approach to feeding Emma, expressing professional curiosity about techniques that had succeeded where medical interventions had failed. Rosa had been modest about her role in Emma's improvement, consistently emphasizing that she had simply provided love and patience rather than any special expertise. She had explained to Dr. Rodriguez that her approach had been based on treating Emma as a whole person rather than focusing solely on her medical condition, acknowledging her fears and preferences while creating positive associations with food and eating. The success had prompted Marcus to reconsider many of his assumptions about caregiving and healing. He had begun to understand that his systematic approach to finding the most qualified professionals had overlooked the importance of human connection and emotional understanding in the healing process. Rosa's lack of formal medical training had actually been an advantage in some ways, allowing her to approach Emma without preconceptions about what should or should not work. As the new year had approached, Marcus had found himself facing a decision he had not expected to have to make. Emma's improvement had been dramatic enough that her doctors were cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis, but they had emphasized that her condition remained serious and would require ongoing careful management. The question of whether to continue with Rosa's informal caregiving arrangement or to return to seeking traditional medical caregivers had become increasingly important as Emma's needs evolved. But for Marcus, the choice had become clear as he had observed the profound bond that had developed between Rosa and his daughter.
Emma had found in Rosa not just a caregiver, but a mentor, confidant, and friend who had helped her rediscover joy and hope during the darkest period of her young life. The thought of disrupting that relationship in favor of more conventional medical care had seemed not only unnecessary, but potentially harmful to Emma's continued recovery. Rosa had remained humble about her role in Emma's improvement, but she had also expressed her commitment to continuing to care for Emma for as long as her help was needed and wanted. She had explained to Marcus that working with Emma had given her own life new purpose and meaning after the loss of her grandson, and that she felt honored to be part of Emma's healing journey. The success of Rosa's unconventional approach had begun to attract attention from other families dealing with similar challenges. Word had spread through networks of parents with seriously ill children about the housekeeper who had succeeded where medical professionals had failed, and Marcus had begun receiving calls from desperate parents seeking advice about their own children's eating difficulties. Rosa had been generous with her time and knowledge, speaking with other families and sharing the techniques and insights she had developed while caring for Emma. She had emphasized that every child was different and that there were no guaranteed solutions, but she had been willing to offer hope and encouragement to families who had run out of conventional options. The attention had been somewhat overwhelming for Rosa, who had never sought recognition for her work and who remained focused primarily on Emma's needs. But she had also recognized the potential value of sharing her experiences with others, understanding that her success with Emma might offer hope to families who were facing similar struggles with traditional medical approaches. As winter had progressed into spring, Emma's continued improvement had validated Rosa's approach and Marcus's decision to trust his instincts about unconventional care. Emma had begun attending school part-time, something that had seemed impossible just months earlier, and she had started participating in age-appropriate activities that brought her joy and social connection. The journey was far from over, and Emma's condition continued to require careful monitoring and management, but the foundation of trust, love, and understanding that Rosa had built had created a platform for ongoing healing and growth that extended far beyond the immediate crisis that had brought them together. Rosa had transformed not just Emma's relationship with food, but the entire family's understanding of what healing could look like when it was approached with patience, creativity, and genuine care for the whole person rather than just the medical condition. The spring sunshine streaming through the kitchen windows illuminated a scene that would have been unimaginable just 6 months earlier. Emma stood on a small wooden step stool beside the marble countertop, her sleeves rolled up and her face focused with concentration as she carefully measured flour into a large mixing bowl. Her cheeks, once hollow and pale, now carried a healthy flush of color, and her eyes sparkled with the kind of enthusiasm that had been absent from her life for so long. Beside her, Rosa guided her movements with gentle hands and encouraging words, treating Emma like the capable young cook she was becoming, rather than the fragile patient she had once been. The transformation had not happened overnight, but by March, Emma had exceeded every expectation that her medical team had dared to hope for. Her weight had stabilized at a healthy level for the first time in years, and her energy levels had returned to something resembling normal childhood vitality. More importantly, her relationship with food had evolved from one of fear and survival to one of curiosity and joy. She had begun requesting specific meals, experimenting with new flavors, and even expressing preferences about how her food was prepared and presented. The success had attracted the attention of medical professionals far beyond Emma's immediate care team. Dr. Rodriguez had documented Emma's remarkable improvement and had begun presenting her case at medical conferences, highlighting the role that emotional and psychological factors could play in the treatment of complex digestive disorders. He had invited Rosa to participate in some of these presentations, recognizing that her intuitive understanding of Emma's needs had contributed to a recovery that traditional medical approaches had failed to achieve. But Rosa had remained reluctant to take credit for Emma's improvement, consistently emphasizing that she had simply provided love and patience while Emma's own strength and resilience had done the real work of healing. She had deflected praise and accolades, preferring to focus on the day-to-day joy of watching Emma discover new foods and develop confidence in her ability to nourish herself. For Rosa, the greatest reward was not professional recognition, but the simple pleasure of seeing Emma laugh while they cooked together. The bond between Emma and Rosa had deepened into something that transcended the traditional caregiver relationship. Emma had begun referring to Rosa as her abuela de cocina, her cooking grandmother, a title that Rosa treasured more than any professional credential she might have earned. They had developed their own language of inside jokes and shared memories, built around the countless hours they had spent together in the kitchen, creating not just meals but lasting connections. Emma's recovery had also begun to heal wounds in the Sullivan family that extended beyond her medical condition. Marcus had started participating in the evening cooking sessions, learning alongside his daughter and rediscovering aspects of fatherhood that had been buried under months of medical crisis and fear. The kitchen had become a gathering place where laughter replaced anxiety and hope replaced desperation, transforming the atmosphere of the entire house. The improvement in Emma's condition had also opened the door for a cautious reconciliation with her mother Sarah. The guilt and grief that had driven Sarah away had begun to ease as Emma's health stabilized and her future became less uncertain. Sarah had started visiting more frequently, initially just for brief afternoon visits but gradually staying for dinner and participating in the family's new traditions around food and cooking. Rosa had welcomed Sarah's return with characteristic grace, understanding that healing a family required patience with all of its members. One particularly meaningful evening in April had marked a turning point in the family's healing process. Emma had insisted on preparing a complete dinner for both of her parents, working with Rosa to plan a menu that showcased the cooking skills she had developed over the previous months. She had prepared herb-crusted chicken breast, roasted vegetables with garlic and rosemary, and a simple but elegant rice pilaf that had become one of her signature dishes. Marcus and Sarah had sat together at the dining room table for the first time in over a year, watching their daughter serve them a meal she had prepared with her own hands. The symbolism had been overwhelming for both parents, who remembered the countless meals that Emma had been unable to eat, and the desperate attempts to coax her to consume even the smallest portions. To see her not just eating but cooking with confidence and joy had represented a miracle that neither of them had dared to imagine possible. Emma had beamed with pride as her parents had praised every dish, her confidence growing with each compliment and expression of amazement at her culinary skills. She had explained the cooking techniques Rosa had taught her, describing the importance of letting meat rest after cooking and how different herbs could enhance the natural flavors of vegetables. Her knowledge and enthusiasm had been infectious, drawing her parents into animated discussions about food and cooking that felt wonderfully normal after so many months of medical conversations. The success of that family dinner had established a new tradition in the Sullivan household. Every Sunday, Emma would plan and prepare a special meal for her family, working with Rosa to challenge herself with new recipes and techniques while ensuring that the dishes remained within her dietary limitations. These Sunday dinners had become celebrations not just of Emma's improving health, but of the family's renewed unity and hope for the future. As Emma's physical recovery had progressed, her emotional and social development had also flourished. She had returned to school full-time in the spring, initially with some anxiety about being around other children after so many months of isolation, but her increased confidence and energy had helped her reconnect with old friendships and form new ones, and she had begun participating in after-school activities that brought her joy and social connection. Emma's teachers had been amazed by her resilience and positive attitude, particularly given what they knew about the medical challenges she had faced. She had thrown herself into her studies with enthusiasm, excelling in subjects that had suffered during the worst periods of her illness. Her creative writing assignments had often featured stories about cooking and family, reflecting the central role that food and Rosa's care had played in her recovery. The school community had embraced Emma's return with warmth and support, but it was Emma's own confidence and enthusiasm that had made her reintegration so successful. She had begun sharing her love of cooking with classmates, sometimes bringing small treats that she had prepared with Rosa to share during special occasions. Her teachers had noted that Emma seemed to have a maturity and appreciation for simple pleasures that was unusual for her age, qualities that likely stemmed from her experience of overcoming serious illness. Rosa's success with Emma had indeed attracted attention from other families struggling with similar challenges, and by summer she had become an unofficial consultant for parents whose children had developed complex relationships with food due to medical conditions. She had maintained her primary commitment to Emma and the Sullivan family, but she had also begun visiting other families on weekends, sharing her insights and techniques with parents who had exhausted conventional medical options. Each family situation had been unique, and Rosa had been careful to emphasize that there were no universal solutions to complex medical and emotional challenges. But her approach of treating children as whole people rather than collections of symptoms had consistently produced positive results, even when complete recovery was not possible. She had helped families find ways to reduce anxiety around mealtimes, develop positive associations with food, and create environments where healing could occur naturally. The word-of-mouth referrals had led to invitations for Rosa to speak at support groups for parents of children with eating disorders and medical conditions affecting nutrition. She had initially been hesitant to take on such a public role, preferring the intimate personal nature of working with individual families. But Marcus had encouraged her to share her insights more broadly, recognizing that her unique perspective could benefit many more children than she could reach through individual consultations. Rosa's presentations to parent groups had been unlike the typical medical or psychological lectures that these families usually encountered. She had spoken from the heart about the importance of patience, the power of small victories, and the need to see children as individuals with unique needs and preferences rather than cases to be solved. Her emphasis on creating positive emotional experiences around food had resonated deeply with parents who had watched their children develop fearful or adversarial relationships with eating. One particularly powerful aspect of Rosa's talks had been her willingness to discuss the emotional toll that caring for seriously ill children had taken on her own life. She had spoken openly about the grief of losing her grandson Miguel and how caring for Emma had helped her find new purpose and meaning in her work. Her vulnerability and honesty had connected with audiences of parents who often felt isolated in their struggles and guilty about their own emotional responses to their children's illnesses. The growing recognition of Rosa's work had led to opportunities that she had never imagined. A local television station had featured her story during a segment on innovative approaches to pediatric care, and a national magazine had written an article about her success with Emma and other children. The attention had been somewhat overwhelming for Rosa, who remained fundamentally humble about her role in these children's recoveries. But the media attention had also created opportunities to reach families who might not have access to the kind of individual care that Rosa could provide. She had worked with nutritionists and child psychologists to develop resources that other caregivers could use, sharing techniques and insights that could be adapted to different situations and circumstances. Her goal had been to democratize the kind of patient-intuitive care that had been so effective with Emma, making it available to families regardless of their economic circumstances. Emma herself had become an advocate for Rosa's approach, speaking at some of the parent support groups about her own experience and encouraging other children not to give up hope even when traditional treatments were not working. Her perspective as a child who had lived through the fear and desperation of serious illness had been particularly powerful for other young patients, offering them a vision of recovery that went beyond mere survival to include joy and fulfillment.
The relationship between Emma and Rosa had continued to evolve as Emma's health stabilized and her independence grew. Rosa had gradually shifted from being Emma's primary caregiver to being more of a mentor and friend, supporting Emma's growing autonomy while remaining available for guidance and comfort when needed. This transition had been managed carefully, ensuring that Emma felt supported rather than abandoned as she regained her independence. By Emma's 9th birthday in August, the celebration had been a testament to how far the family had come since those dark days when Emma's survival had been uncertain.
The party had been held in the garden behind the Sullivan house, with Emma helping to plan the menu and prepare many of the dishes herself. Friends from school had joined family members in celebrating not just Emma's birthday, but her remarkable recovery and the bright future that lay ahead of her. Marcus had given a brief speech during the party, expressing his gratitude to Rosa and acknowledging the role that her care had played in saving not just Emma's life, but the entire family's future. He had spoken about the lessons he had learned about the importance of approaching challenges with an open mind and the value of recognizing wisdom in unexpected places. His words had moved many of the guests to tears, particularly those who remembered the desperate man he had been just a year earlier. Rosa had been honored during the celebration, but she had characteristically redirected attention back to Emma, praising her courage and determination throughout her illness and recovery. She had presented Emma with a special gift, a leather-bound cookbook where they could record all the recipes they had developed together, along with notes about techniques and modifications that worked best for Emma's specific needs. The cookbook had become Emma's most treasured possession, representing not just her culinary education, but the loving relationship that had made her recovery possible. As the summer had turned to fall, Emma had started 4th grade with enthusiasm and confidence that would have seemed impossible during the worst periods of her illness. She had joined the school's cooking club, sharing her knowledge with other students and continuing to develop her skills under Rosa's guidance. Her teachers had noted that she seemed to have an unusual appreciation for the simple pleasures of life, qualities that likely stemmed from her experience of nearly losing everything. The stability of Emma's condition had allowed the family to begin making longer-term plans for the first time in years. Marcus and Sarah had finalized their divorce, but they had maintained an amicable relationship centered around their shared commitment to Emma's continued health and happiness. They had developed a co-parenting arrangement that recognized the central role that Rosa played in Emma's life, ensuring that her care and guidance remained consistent, regardless of which parent Emma was staying with. Rosa had been offered positions with other wealthy families who had heard about her success with Emma, some offering significantly higher salaries and more prestigious circumstances. But she had chosen to remain with the Sullivan family, explaining that her commitment to Emma went beyond professional obligations. Emma had become like a granddaughter to her, and the thought of leaving during such a crucial period in her development had been unthinkable. The decision to stay had been mutually beneficial. Emma had continued to thrive under Rosa's patient guidance, and Rosa had found deep satisfaction in watching the child she had helped to heal grow into a confident, capable young person. Their relationship had provided both of them with something precious. Emma had gained a loving mentor who believed in her potential, and Rosa had found renewed purpose and joy in her work. As Emma's story had spread through various networks, it had become a source of inspiration for families facing similar challenges around the world. Parents had reached out through social media and support networks, sharing their own stories and seeking advice about how to help their children develop healthier relationships with food and eating. Rosa had tried to respond to as many of these requests as possible, offering encouragement and practical suggestions while always emphasizing that every child's situation was unique. The broader impact of Emma's recovery had extended beyond individual families to influence thinking in the medical community about the treatment of complex pediatric conditions. Several doctors had begun incorporating elements of Rosa's approach into their own practices, recognizing that addressing the emotional and psychological aspects of eating disorders could be as important as treating the underlying medical conditions. Research studies had been initiated to examine the factors that had contributed to Emma's remarkable recovery, with the goal of developing more comprehensive treatment protocols that addressed both the medical and emotional dimensions of complex eating disorders. Rosa had participated in some of this research, though she had remained skeptical about the ability of formal studies to capture the intuitive, relationship-based aspects of care that had been so crucial to Emma's healing. As the first anniversary of Rosa's arrival at the Sullivan house had approached, the family had planned a quiet celebration to mark the transformation that had occurred over the previous year. Emma had insisted on preparing a special meal that showcased all the skills she had learned, creating a menu that told the story of her recovery through food. Each dish had represented a milestone in her journey from fear to confidence, from survival to thriving. The celebration had been attended by Dr. Rodriguez and several other members of Emma's medical team who had wanted to witness firsthand the remarkable changes in their young patient. They had been amazed not just by Emma's physical recovery, but by her enthusiasm and confidence, qualities that represented healing that went far beyond the resolution of medical symptoms. During the dinner, Emma had stood up to make her own speech, thanking Rosa for saving her life and teaching her that food could be a source of joy rather than fear. Her words had been simple but profound, expressing gratitude not just for the technical aspects of Rosa's care, but for the love and patience that had made recovery possible. She had concluded by announcing that she wanted to become a chef when she grew up, so that she could help other people discover the joy of cooking and eating. Rosa had been deeply moved by Emma's speech, recognizing that the child's dreams for the future represented the ultimate validation of all the patient work they had done together. To hear Emma talk about food and cooking with such enthusiasm, after witnessing the fear and desperation that had once characterized her relationship with eating, had been profoundly gratifying for Rosa. The evening had concluded with Emma and Rosa working together to prepare a simple dessert, their practiced teamwork and easy conversation demonstrating the deep bond that had developed between them. Marcus had watched them work, marveling at the transformation in both his daughter and his own understanding of what healing could look like when it was approached with love, rather than just medical expertise. As Emma had grown stronger and more independent, Rosa had begun to see her role evolving from caregiver to life mentor. She had started teaching Emma not just cooking techniques but life skills, helping her develop confidence and resilience that would serve her well as she continued to grow and face new challenges. The kitchen had remained the center of their relationship, but their conversations had expanded to cover dreams, fears, friendships, and all the complexities of growing up. The success of Emma's recovery had created ripple effects throughout the Sullivan family and beyond. Marcus had become an advocate for innovative approaches to pediatric care, using his business platform to support research into the emotional and psychological aspects of childhood illness. Sarah had returned to work as a nurse, inspired by Rosa's example to focus on the holistic care of young patients. But perhaps the most significant impact had been on Emma herself, who had emerged from her illness with a deep appreciation for life's simple pleasures and an understanding of the power of perseverance in the face of seemingly impossible challenges. Her experience had given her wisdom and empathy unusual for her age, qualities that would serve her well throughout her life. As the story of Emma's recovery had spread, it had become a testament to the transformative power of love, patience, and the willingness to approach problems with creativity and openness rather than rigid adherence to conventional solutions. Rosa's success had demonstrated that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from the most qualified professionals, but from ordinary people who approach extraordinary challenges with extraordinary compassion. The journey from desperation to hope, from a dying child to a thriving young person, had been made possible by the simple act of one woman choosing to try when everyone else had given up. Rosa's legacy would live on not just in Emma's recovery, but in the countless other families who had been inspired by their story to seek healing through love, patience, and the belief that miracles are possible when we approach them with open hearts and minds. 5 years had passed since Rosa Martinez first walked through the doors of the Sullivan estate carrying her canvas bags and wooden spice box, and the transformation that had taken place seemed almost mythical to those who remembered the desperate circumstances that had brought her there. Emma, now 13 years old, stood confidently at the stove in the renovated kitchen that had been redesigned specifically to accommodate her growing passion for culinary arts. Her movements were fluid and practiced as she prepared a complex sauce reduction, her technique refined through years of dedicated practice under Rosa's patient tutelage. The kitchen itself had become a testament to Emma's journey from near death to vibrant health. What had once been a sterile, rarely used space designed more for entertaining than actual cooking had been transformed into a warm, functional culinary workshop. Professional-grade equipment lined the counters, recipe books filled custom-built shelves, and the walls displayed photographs documenting Emma's culinary adventures and achievements over the years. The centerpiece of the room was a large farmhouse table where Emma had learned her first lessons in food preparation, now serving as both workspace and gathering place for the family meals that had become sacred rituals in the Sullivan household. Emma's physical transformation was remarkable, but even more striking was her evolution as a person. The frail, frightened child who had once cowered from every meal had grown into a confident teenager whose very presence seemed to radiate health and vitality. She had developed into an accomplished young chef whose skills impressed even professional culinary instructors, but more importantly, she had become a source of inspiration and hope for countless families struggling with similar challenges. The success of Emma's recovery had led to opportunities that neither she nor Rosa had ever imagined possible. Emma had been featured in several national magazines as a symbol of resilience and recovery, and she had appeared on cooking shows where her story of overcoming illness through the healing power of food had touched millions of viewers. Despite the attention, Emma had remained grounded and focused on using her platform to help other children who were facing medical challenges related to eating and nutrition. At 13, Emma had already established her own non-profit organization dedicated to supporting families dealing with pediatric eating disorders. The foundation provided grants for families who could not afford specialized care, funded research into innovative treatment approaches, and connected families with caregivers who had been trained in Rosa's methods. Emma's personal involvement in every aspect of the organization's work demonstrated a level of maturity and compassion that impressed even seasoned philanthropists and medical professionals. Rosa, now 58 years old, had become something of a legend in the world of pediatric care. Her innovative approach to treating children with complex eating disorders had been studied and documented by researchers around the world, and she had been invited to speak at medical conferences in countries as far away as Japan and Sweden. Despite the international recognition, Rosa had remained true to her core values, continuing to work primarily with individual families and refusing to commercialize her methods in ways that might compromise their effectiveness. The relationship between Emma and Rosa had evolved into something unique and beautiful, transcending traditional categories of family, friendship, or professional association. Emma had indeed become like a granddaughter to Rosa, while Rosa had assumed a role in Emma's life that was part mentor, part second mother, and part best friend. Their bond had been forged in the crucible of life-threatening illness and had been strengthened through years of shared experiences, mutual respect, and genuine love. Marcus Sullivan had been forever changed by witnessing his daughter's transformation and Rosa's role in making it possible. The driven, ambitious CEO who had once believed that money and power could solve any problem had developed a profound appreciation for the simple, human elements of care and compassion that had ultimately saved his daughter's life. He had redirected much of his business focus toward healthcare ventures, using his wealth and influence to support innovative approaches to pediatric medicine and to ensure that other families had access to the kind of care that had made Emma's recovery possible. The Sullivan family itself had been rebuilt on a foundation of gratitude and shared purpose that was much stronger than their original structure had been. Marcus and Sarah, while remaining divorced, had developed a partnership centered around supporting Emma's continued health and their shared mission of helping other families.
They had learned to work together effectively, their former conflicts set aside in favor of their common goal of ensuring that Emma's second chance at life was used to make a meaningful difference in the world. Sarah had indeed returned to nursing with a renewed sense of purpose, specializing in pediatric care and bringing Rosa's insights about the emotional aspects of childhood illness into her professional practice.
She had become an advocate within the medical community for more holistic approaches to treating sick children, arguing that addressing psychological and emotional needs was just as important as managing physical symptoms. Her personal experience with Emma's illness and recovery had given her a unique perspective that resonated with both colleagues and patients' families. Emma's academic journey had been as remarkable as her physical recovery. Despite missing significant school time during the worst periods of her illness, she had not only caught up with her peers, but had excelled beyond grade level in several subjects. Her teachers consistently noted her exceptional maturity, empathy for others, and ability to find creative solutions to complex problems. These qualities, undoubtedly shaped by her experience of overcoming serious illness, had made her a natural leader among her classmates and a source of support for other students facing challenges. The culinary program that Emma had developed at her school had become a model for other institutions seeking to incorporate life skills education into their curricula. Working with Rosa, Emma had designed a curriculum that taught not just cooking techniques but also nutrition, food safety, cultural appreciation, and the therapeutic aspects of food preparation. The program had been particularly beneficial for students dealing with stress, anxiety, and other emotional challenges, providing them with practical skills while also offering a form of therapy through creative expression. Emma's influence had extended far beyond her immediate school community. She had established cooking clubs at several local hospitals, working with young patients to help them develop positive associations with food while they recovered from various illnesses. These programs had been remarkably successful, with participating children showing improved appetite, better cooperation with medical treatments, and enhanced overall mood during their hospital stays. The therapeutic cooking programs had attracted attention from medical professionals who were beginning to recognize the profound connection between emotional well-being and physical healing. Several major medical centers had implemented similar programs, hiring trained culinary therapists who had been educated in Rosa's methods. The programs had shown measurable benefits for young patients, including reduced anxiety around medical procedures, improved compliance with dietary requirements, and faster overall recovery times. Rosa's influence on the field of pediatric care had extended well beyond her direct work with individual families. She had collaborated with researchers to develop formal protocols for incorporating emotional and psychological support into the treatment of eating disorders and other conditions affecting nutrition. These protocols had been adopted by healthcare institutions across the country, ensuring that future generations of sick children would have access to more comprehensive care than had been available when Emma was first diagnosed. The research that had grown out of Emma's case had contributed to a broader understanding of the complex relationships between trauma, emotional health, and physical healing in children. Studies had documented the ways that fear and anxiety could exacerbate medical conditions, while positive emotional experiences could actually enhance the effectiveness of traditional medical treatments. This research had validated Rosa's intuitive understanding that healing sick children required addressing their hearts and minds as well as their bodies. Emma's story had also sparked important conversations about the role of caregivers in the medical system and the value of different types of expertise in treating complex conditions. The fact that Rosa, without formal medical training, had succeeded where 15 highly qualified professionals had failed, had challenged assumptions about credentials and competence in healthcare settings. This had led to more inclusive approaches to assembling care teams, with recognition that sometimes the most effective interventions come from unexpected sources. The success of Rosa's approach had not been limited to cases involving eating disorders. Families dealing with children who had various chronic conditions had found that Rosa's emphasis on emotional support, patience, and individualized care could be adapted to address a wide range of medical challenges. Children with diabetes, autoimmune disorders, and other conditions requiring long-term management had benefited from caregivers trained in Rosa's methods, showing improved adherence to treatment regimens and better overall quality of life. As Emma had entered her teenage years, she had begun to articulate her own philosophy about healing and helping others, drawing on her personal experience, while also incorporating insights from Rosa's teachings and her own observations of human nature. She had developed a mature understanding of the importance of hope in recovery, recognizing that her own healing had been made possible not just by Rosa's practical interventions, but by the unwavering belief that improvement was possible, even in the darkest circumstances. Emma's public speaking engagements had become increasingly sophisticated and impactful as she had grown older and more experienced. She had addressed medical conferences, parent support groups, and fundraising events with a poise and wisdom that impressed audiences who might initially have been skeptical about listening to a teenager discuss complex medical and emotional issues. Her first-hand experience of life-threatening illness, combined with her remarkable recovery, had given her a credibility and authenticity that resonated powerfully with listeners. The foundation that Emma had established had grown into a significant force in the field of pediatric healthcare, funding research, supporting families, and training caregivers in innovative approaches to treating sick children. The organization had maintained Emma's vision of combining practical support with emotional healing, ensuring that families received not just financial assistance, but also access to the kind of compassionate care that had been so crucial to Emma's own recovery. Rosa had remained actively involved in the Foundation's work, serving as both a board member and the chief architect of the training programs for caregivers. She had developed comprehensive curricula that taught the technical aspects of caring for children with complex medical needs, while also emphasizing the importance of building emotional connections and creating positive experiences around food and eating. The training programs had graduated hundreds of caregivers who had gone on to work with families around the world, spreading Rosa's influence far beyond what she could have achieved through individual practice alone. The relationship between Emma and Rosa had provided both of them with profound personal fulfillment that extended far beyond their shared work in helping other families. For Emma, Rosa had represented the possibility of unconditional love and support during the most vulnerable period of her life. For Rosa, Emma had provided an opportunity to channel her grief over losing her grandson into something positive and life-affirming, creating meaning from loss in a way that had helped her heal her own emotional wounds. As Emma had grown into adolescence, she had developed her own voice and perspective while still maintaining deep appreciation for Rosa's influence on her life. She had begun to articulate her own goals and dreams, which included not just culinary pursuits, but also broader ambitions related to healthcare, social justice, and helping people overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Her vision for her future had been shaped by her experience of recovery, but it had also been influenced by her natural intelligence, creativity, and compassion. The impact of Emma's story had reached people in circumstances far removed from her own privileged background. Families dealing with poverty, immigration, and other social challenges had found inspiration in her journey from desperation to hope, recognizing that the core elements of her recovery, love, patience, and refusing to give up, were available to anyone regardless of their economic circumstances. This universality had been one of the most powerful aspects of Emma's story, demonstrating that healing was possible even in the absence of unlimited resources. Emma's influence had also extended into the realm of food culture more broadly, with her story contributing to growing awareness about the emotional and psychological dimensions of eating. Restaurants, schools, and other institutions had begun to pay more attention to creating positive environments around food, recognizing that the context in which people eat could be just as important as the nutritional content of what they consume. The culinary world had embraced Emma as a unique voice representing the healing power of food and cooking. Several renowned chefs had mentored her, recognizing both her natural talent and her deeper understanding of food's capacity to comfort, heal, and bring people together. These relationships had enriched Emma's culinary education, while also exposing established professionals to new perspectives about the role of cooking in promoting health and well-being. As Emma approached her 14th birthday, The anniversary had provided an opportunity to reflect on the remarkable journey that had brought her family from the brink of tragedy to a place of hope and purpose. The contrast between the frightened, dying child she had been and the confident, healthy teenager she had become seemed almost impossible to believe, yet the transformation had been documented and witnessed by countless people whose lives had been touched by her story. The celebration of Emma's 14th birthday had been both a personal milestone and a public event, with families from around the world sending messages of congratulation and gratitude for the hope that Emma's recovery had provided to them. The event had been held at the Sullivan estate, but it had been broadcast live to allow participation from the global community that had grown around Emma's foundation and Rosa's work. During the celebration, Emma had announced her intention to write a cookbook that would combine her favorite recipes with stories about her recovery and insights about the healing power of food. The cookbook would serve multiple purposes, sharing practical recipes and techniques that had been developed during her recovery, providing inspiration for other families facing similar challenges, and raising funds for her foundation's continued work. Publishers had already expressed strong interest in the project, recognizing both its commercial potential and its potential for positive social impact. Rosa had been honored during the birthday celebration as the person whose love and dedication had made Emma's recovery possible, but she had characteristically deflected attention back to Emma and the other families they had worked with together. In her brief remarks, Rosa had emphasized that Emma's recovery had been the result of many people's efforts, including the medical professionals who had provided crucial support even when their initial treatments had not been successful. The evening had concluded with Emma and Rosa working together to prepare a special dessert for all the guests, their practiced collaboration demonstrating the deep partnership that had developed between them over the years. The sight of them working together, laughing and chatting as they put finishing touches on an elaborate cake, had provided a powerful visual representation of the healing that was possible when love and expertise combined to address both the practical and emotional needs of sick children. As the guests had departed, and the family had settled into the quiet aftermath of the celebration, Emma had expressed her gratitude not just for her recovery, but for the opportunity to use her experience to help others. She had spoken about her sense of responsibility to make the most of her second chance at life, and her determination to ensure that other families would have access to the kind of care that had saved her. Looking toward the future, Emma's plans had encompassed both personal goals and broader ambitions for social change. She had expressed interest in eventually studying medicine, with the goal of becoming a pediatric specialist who could integrate Rosa's insights about emotional healing with advanced medical knowledge. She had also talked about expanding her foundation's work internationally, ensuring that children around the world could benefit from the approaches to healing that had been so effective in her own case. Rosa had expressed her own hopes for the future, which had centered primarily around seeing Emma continue to thrive and use her gifts to help others. She had also talked about her desire to continue developing and refining her methods for helping sick children, recognizing that each family's situation was unique and required individualized approaches. Her goal had been to train enough caregivers in her methods to ensure that no family would have to face the kind of desperation that the Sullivans had experienced before finding her. The legacy of Emma's recovery and Rosa's innovative approach to caregiving had already begun to influence how society thought about healing, hope, and the importance of addressing human needs holistically, rather than focusing solely on medical symptoms. Their story had demonstrated that sometimes the most profound healing comes from the simplest human gestures, patience, love, and the willingness to keep trying when conventional approaches have failed. As the years continued to pass, Emma's story would undoubtedly inspire countless other families facing seemingly impossible medical challenges, while Rosa's methods would continue to evolve and spread to help children around the world. The transformation that had begun with one desperate father's decision to try something different had ultimately created ripples of healing and hope that would continue to expand for generations to come, proving that miracles are possible when we approach suffering with open hearts and unlimited determination to find solutions.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.